Daniel Lucas, welcome to The Humanist.
Hi, Chad.
It's great to have you on. You are a podcast host yourself. You do a lot of really interesting things, and we like to have interesting people on The Humanist. You have an interesting career journey and before like becoming an ultra marathoner.
Mhm.
But I'm curious, like in some of your story that I know you share a lot about, is I think if I understand, you were about 25 and then you decided to get serious and go to school, but the schooling that you went to, well, you really grinded while you were doing it and you burned out.
Yeah.
And then you go on to have this journey as an ultra marathoner. So what I'm like in knowing some of this about your story, one of the curiosities that I have is like, well, I don't know. I'm like, why did you grind so hard to burn out? But then, of course, like what was it in you that discovered this need and this desire to go as hard and intensely as you did? So big
Yeah.
questions, I guess.
Yeah, they're big questions, but I have the benefit of hindsight. I'll be 47 this year, and so I've had time to think about why I did what I did and where I missed the mark. And
Hmm.
uh, with I'm going to start with your first question, why I chose to like double down at the age of 25 and go back to school. I didn't have a degree. I was working in a plant and decided I'll just go at night until I'm done. And the answer is I had just gotten married, and I thought,
Mhm.
I never got a degree, and I feel the need to prove myself that I can do this. And I actually had a decent job at the time, what I consider to be decent. And
Yeah, what were you doing at the plant?
I was an IT guy,
Okay.
basic computer updates, computer replace. So I was already in the IT field, and I had a lot of IT certifications. To be fair, it wasn't like I was
Ah.
didn't know what I was doing. But I also knew that in a corporate type environment and whatnot, if you have a bachelor's, you're a lot safer. So I went after that bachelor's, and it was definitely a humbling experience in the sense that I went summers as well. So I ended up going for 7 straight years and got my master's degree. So I went from just a couple of electives that I got when I was younger to getting a master's degree, and it was not a healthy journey. The bachelor's degree was fueled by about 2 pots of coffee a day,
Mm.
about 4 to 5 hours of sleep a night. And when I got to my master's degree, which was a little shy of a 2-year program, I made a deal with my wife at the time and said, "We will never open a book on Sunday, and we'll never get less than 8 hours of sleep." And she agreed to do it with me. So that was part of the way that we sort of started to bring balance into it.
Hmm.
And it was actually, I really enjoyed the master's program. To be quite honest with you, the material was a lot more relevant to what I was wanting to learn. So it was not nearly as arduous. And if you saw pictures of me when I was going through that journey, I almost looked like a different person, even though I was, a little more than half the age I am now. I had these huge dark circles under my eyes permanently. I was probably about 20 pounds overweight and was just constantly in a fight or flight type, you know, studying, cramming for a test, crashing, working overtime, trying to make some cash at the plant, all those things. How did that lead to ultra running? It was a
Well,
combination.
I guess in a way, you're already describing how you were willing to be a hard worker. You, uh,
Yeah, but a lot of that was full fuel. There was a Freudian slip for you. Uh, it was I fooled myself with a lot of self-shaming, saying I don't feel like I can really measure up to what I should be unless I have this
Hmm.
degree. I don't really feel like I can measure up until I have a huge title at this corporate office by the time I'm 35. So I was a lot of it putting pressure on myself to say, until this is done, you're just really kidding yourself. And
Hmm.
you know, there's some of that that's healthy. You need to put expectations on yourself. But I never took time to really congratulate myself. I mean, as soon as I got through a semester, I was like, you're just getting started. And one of the things I was actually talking to my son about this, my son is very intelligent. He's 15. He's very insightful, far smarter than I ever was. We didn't have the internet growing up.
Oh yeah.
The internet did not come out till I was about 18. So, uh, point being, I told my son the best accomplishments I've ever had in my life were when I put my back up against the wall and burnt the bridge behind me and said, in the case of school, I didn't have a lot of money and I had just bought my first house. So I would go pay all my tuition with cash and say, now, if you drop this class or fail, it's money out of your pocket. And that was always a big motivator for me was
Hmm.
I paid for it out of my own pocket. There's no loan. And if I don't attend a class, if I decide to start taking Thursdays off and skipping that class, it's me that's picking up the tab. That same logic very much applied to ultra running because I would say, yeah, it's a 50-mile run. Yeah, it's a 100-mile run. And there's days where 5 miles feels like an eternity. But I also would say there were 2 rules. Number 1, I had to show up to the start line. And number 2 was I have no issue throwing in the towel as long as I can't move anymore. So between
That's
those
pretty
2 things, I had a
intense.
pretty good record for showing up and finding out what I was capable of.
Okay, so now I tell you what, I have one brother, a younger brother, and he is your age actually, and he is doing this. He's not he hasn't done 100 yet, but he's
Mhm.
done multiple 50s, and this very day he's on the trails running, I think something like 21 miles or something. And so I have been hearing firsthand the mileages that go into it. And yeah, so I guess, but it's like, why not just like run a little bit? Or like, what was this attraction to the going really long?
Yeah, well, again, I have the benefit of hindsight again because it's been a few years,
Yes,
but,
please share that.
the hindsight was that there just wasn't enough personal challenge in my career, and I
Hmm.
felt like I was going soft, and so I said to myself, "Wow, this job is really boring. I don't feel challenged. I don't as an existential I was probably approaching my existential crises around 35, 36.
Yeah.
And I was going, if this is it, if going to this job and if this is hard, and I don't mean in terms of a sort of like what's my value as a person so much as to say, if this is all the effort you're going to put into your life, is this middle management role? And at the time, I didn't. I'd kind of burnt out on career at that point after getting out of school and getting stuck in a job that just didn't have a ladder up or down. And I said, well, you know what? I'm going to focus on developing myself outside of the office. And it started with triathlons, which I did an Ironman.
Mhm.
And then once I found trails, the reason that I was addicted to trail running as much as I was, and I still love it to this day,
Yeah.
is it's unlike triathlons. Triathlons are perfect if you're OCD because there's no shortage of details that any OCD executive can pay attention to with your bike, with the rules. You have to stay certain number of bike lengths behind the bike in front of you. You
Mhm.
know, there's wetsuits that are this deep versus this deep, and whether that's legal. And then if you want to qualify for Kona, that's a totally different thing because there's different rules if you want to qualify for Kona. And I found that I actually didn't like having all the rules. I just wanted the challenge. And so when I moved to trail running, it was not only one, it was less rules, but it was time in nature. And it was the vast majority of trail running, you're by yourself, even in a race. You're
Which
by
sounds
yourself.
hard to me in a way. So, but it was
It's
comforting for
super
you.
hard. It's super hard.
Okay.
It's in fact, it's so much harder from a mental standpoint than any type of organized marathon or triathlon because you will not see people aid stations. Okay, when you're in a triathlon, you're going to have an aid station every 5 to 10 minutes. You'll be able to jump in, get a Gatorade. They cheer you on. They tell you what a
Right.
great person you are. They have signs out there. There's music. When you're trail running an ultra, you don't see crap for 2, 3 hours at a time in a lot of cases. And there's no one at the finish who gives a rip of whether you finish or not. So there is
Wow.
no
Yeah.
sort of external praise and affirmation of who you are. It is very much an internal, pure sport of you did this because you wanted to do it. My kids, I could run an ultra that morning. I'd come home by lunch and they didn't even care. They were just every now and then they would say, "Well, did you win?" And I'd say, "No." And they go, "Well, then why'd you do it?" And at their ages at the time, they just didn't get what I was trying to accomplish. But the point of the trail one, in terms of mentally, it developed me to say, I don't know what I'm capable of, but I
Mhm.
know that this will help me determine, like, as Goggins would say, like, when you think you're on empty, there's still another 40% in reserve. That's completely true. I do not agree with everything Goggins says, and I was an ultra runner before he was, but we actually ran some of the same races.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
But my point there is to say he is right about that point. You do have more in your tank than you realize.
So when that he says, yeah, when you think you're done, you're only at 40%.
He says there's 40% left in the reserve, and
Oh,
that's about right.
40% left.
Yeah. So, for example, you don't really start digging into the mental well until you've been running for about 6 hours, and then you start finding out. The body starts to fall apart after about 3 hours, and that's why people struggle with the last 5, 6 miles of a marathon. Is you're about 3 hours in, and it's only when you get to that point of you've kind of been on your feet for like 6, 7 hours, and you realize you have at least another 15 hours to go, whatever,
Wow.
that's when your ego sort of separates, and you get to find out what's behind this facade, because it's really hard to fake who you are after you've been doing this for like 15 hours. You get like, when people talk to you at 15 hours, you're like, I don't have time to put up a facade. It's all I can do to stand here. So
Fascinating.
yeah, and then the other, I didn't come up with this quote, but Ayn Rand, which was one of the first female who dominated ultra running for years.
Oh, did she?
Yeah, if you ever read Born to Run, she's the woman they talk about in that book. But the point is to say, one of her quotes was, "You get to experience with a 100 miler, you get to experience a whole years of emotion in one day." And I agree with that. There's happiness, sadness, depression, anxiety, fulfillment, runner's high, runner's low. You get it all in a period of like 25 hours, 24 hours, something like that.
I've ran one marathon and I was feeling pretty great until mile 18. Yeah,
Hmm.
and you're right. And then it was, I think I was averaging 8 minute, 8:15 miles. And then,
Hmm.
but I slowed down so much for and it was hurting so bad that I ended up with like a 9:46 average time.
I think, Chad, you just defined almost everybody's first marathon experience, including mine. I was doing great until mile 18, and then I stopped to get a drink of Gatorade, and I had what I called Pinocchio legs after that. I could not bend my knees. And I carried a voice recorder my first few marathons. I've been voice journaling for about 16 years.
Okay.
And I still go back and listen to those voice journals of being at different stages of the marathon, because the present us, especially without the benefit of hearing our own voice, and this is the difference between typing a journal. I journal almost every day with typing, but when I go back and listen to those voice journals, it's hard not to empathize, because I can hear in my voice whether it was I was in a race, or maybe just going through a bad relationship or a career crisis. When I hear my voice saying, "Man, Daniel, future Daniel, I'm asking you for advice on this because I don't know what to do." If you don't hear that, it's easy to say, "Man, I don't know why it was so hard. I just did this and it worked out and blah, blah, blah." But when you go back and hear your voice say, "Man, I
Yeah.
don't know what to do. I'm struggling. I want to do the right thing here by my family, by my integrity, by my boss, by my, girlfriend, by my wife." When I hear that, I go, "Man, it's a miracle I even solved the deadgum thing, or got through it."
Yeah.
But if I don't hear that, it's easy to say, "I don't know what my problem was. I just sort of drug it out and da 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 da."
So you learned a lot about yourself doing this,
Right.
and that it was that. So it was you felt this internal. I want to see what I'm capable of.
Yeah, well, I mean, for example, when you go back to your day job after you've done one of these, you realize just how, when you think, "Oh, this is a challenge day," it's like, this isn't that challenging. I haven't even gone into a bad place in this job before to where I feel like I'm emotionally dry." So it builds your reserve of grit and mindset to be much more stoic and resilient. Probably resilience, probably the key word there. Um, Nassim Taleb wrote a book called Anti-Fragile.
Yeah.
If you've read it, the principle is that there was no such word as anti-fragile, and anti-fragile means something that gets stronger the more it's damaged. That is, and that's not resilient, because resilient means that it can handle it and go back to where it was. Anti-fragile is where you're actually better than you were because it was damaged. An example of that would be
Huh.
if you break a bone and you heal it properly, it'll be stronger than it was before
Yeah.
because of what builds around it. Well, it's no different when you're training. For example, if you're trying to be like your brother probably knows this, when you're training, what you're doing is you're doing micro tears to your exoskeleton so that you build up your joints and muscles to the point that they can handle that type of damage without tearing. If you have someone who is not trained properly for an ultra, let alone a marathon, and they try to do it, they might get to the finish, but there's going to be a high likelihood of some injuries in the process.
Serious
I
damage.
mean,
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many people put a marathon on their bucket list. They say, "Oh, I'm going from the couch to the marathon in 6 months," and I go, "You might make it, but you're probably never going to do one again because it'll be just a miserable experience." And
Well, that's what, yes. I was kind of crossfitting and and then we're like, and do a marathon, and I was like, okay. And I came to the end of it, Daniel, and I was like, this is miserable. This was
yeah,
damn this, how is this healthy for the body?
yeah.
But the way you just explained that, with the getting like, I'm because it's mind-boggling that people like you're running marathons every day or frequently in training. How so?
Well, the point of that, Chad, I don't want to focus on the physical aspect of it. The point
Sure.
of it was to say, how does that affect you in your regular life with your
Yes.
wife,
Yes.
with your kids? And the idea is that you're doing micro tears to your mind in a
Mm.
way. You're breaking it down so that it comes back stronger. And so when you have adversity in life that has nothing to do with your physical adversity, it could be something like, your boss asked you for a big project, or you as a consultant, you say, "Man, this challenge is going to push me to my brink if I decide to take this on." The idea there is that you have that reserve within yourself and go, "Look, I've tested myself before.
Mhm.
I kind of know I've got a reserve here," and that you're able to take on those challenges.
So that it's taught you some powerful life lessons.
Oh yeah, for sure, man. And it hasn't stopped either, because almost
Mhm.
any time I'm struggling with something, um, and learning a psychological principle, for example, and I've recently started reading a lot of like Jung's literature on
Yeah.
identifying your shadow self and things like that. There isn't almost ever an analogy that I can't take back to training for somebody and say, this is how that same principle is when you're trying to train for something. This is that same principle in a diet. The other thing I like is uh, financial analogies, because I've definitely become more financially astute over the last 20 something years, and learned the difference between making money and making wealth are two completely different things. So, same thing. You learn those principles by pushing yourself in an endeavor. And, kind of like touching a hot stove. When you push yourself physically, you remember it, it makes a mark in your head.
Yeah.
Um, Losing $100 or whatever, you might not even think about that in 2 or 3 days. Or losing a job, even, you'll get another job someday, and sometimes you go, it wasn't that big a deal. But when you make a mark on yourself physically, your body tattoos it into your brain like, this is a learning experience. You know, make sure you get something out of it.
It's kind of inspiring. How well, actually, let me ask this before we while I'm still thinking of it. Because that you reminded me of that Nietzsche quote of that which doesn't
Break you,
kill
makes you
me
stronger. Yeah.
makes me stronger.
Yeah.
But sometimes some things beat you up and they just beat you up.
Yeah, and, by the way, that's a very generalized quote. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I
Mhm.
think that it has a lot of application. It is in the sense of being anti-fragile. I think it's a good thing. But then you could sit there and argue with that Nietzsche quote. Well, I'm smoking cigarettes and it doesn't kill me, so it makes me stronger. Well, not necessarily,
Right.
right? So the question is the input that you're doing damage with, is it something that will strategically make you a better person? The Stoics would say all their principles are designed towards a life worth living. That is the goal, a life worth living. So
Hmm.
when you have adversity, you need to be strategic and say, is this leading me towards a life worth living? For example, I'm sure we've all had these friends. I don't know that I've been the exception here either, but are you repeating your relationship mistakes because you keep dating the same type of people over and over and going, I don't know what's wrong. I just attract wrong. Well, that's an example of that's not leading you towards a life worth living. You're just repeating the same mistake. And
Yes.
it's it doesn't kill you, but it's not making you stronger. You're just repeating the same mistake.
Good example. Good example. So it's taught you a lot of things. What and how many ultras did you do? And what is an ultra? About 100?
Ultra is considered anything over the distance of a marathon. Probably the most
Oh,
popular ultra distance is definitely the 50K distance, which is about 31, 32 miles. And I've ran I mean, I don't know how many I ran. I did them for about 5 years. And there was a point there where I was doing at least one or two a month. And as far as like distances 100 or longer,
that's what I was curious about.
uh,
Yeah.
probably five or so. There were some training runs I did that were 100 miles, where we just basically it was unofficial races. You would just get at the beginning of the trail. And actually, the one thing I miss about that sport, Chad,
Yeah.
is the camaraderie that you would experience when you stood next to somebody and said, "Buddy, we're going to start this thing on Friday morning, and we're not going to stop until we get to the finish. It's a 100-mile run." Just the two of you in the woods, the three of you, you will build such a bond that 10 years later you'll be like, I know that guy's character. I've seen him and he's a good guy or whatever. You see and you learn a lot about it's a way to build that bond. There are guys I've done that with that I can just pick up the phone with and haven't talked to in 5 years and know we got a special connection here that not too many people share that. I mean, you don't get that from texting somebody once a month. I'll put it that way.
Right. So some special, an extraordinary, do you, what made you choose to not do it? Have you had injuries?
I hit my last like super big ultra I did for my 40th birthday. I ran at the time, it's not anymore, but at the time it was one of the hardest races in the world. And it was called Fat Dog in Canada. It was a 200-kilometer race in the Canadian Rockies. And it was the
Hmm.
only ultra that I had dropped out of. And at 38, I tried to do it, and my mind wasn't in the right place. I can tell you, it was one of the few ultras I went into, and my mind wasn't in the right place.
Hmm.
That played a role. I broke my toe right before the race, so I had to have it pulled straight like two or 3 weeks before the race. I couldn't run properly, and I felt like I had to prove to everybody I could still do the race. And it was very much the race did a rope a dope Muhammad Ali, or Muhammad Ali, George Foreman with me because I was so focused on my ego and saying, I know I can do this, that I became ignorant of what was going on around me and not looking at the red flags with my body saying, you're not doing this right. You're not doing this right. And I ignored those signals to my detriment. So I threw in the towel. I went into hypothermia, by the way. So because I
So it's
just
super cold. Like describe these conditions. What was the elevation? And
Uh,
and were you going
yeah,
up and
so
down huge mountains?
I learned a very powerful lesson, and that is anytime you're going into elevation, the weather's
Mhm.
can be dramatically different at the top than it is the bottom. But in Canada, it is definitely that magnifying glass gets turned up in terms of what the weather is at the bottom versus the top. And in this particular case, we had several thunderstorms and cold rain, and I had all my gear at mile 50, and I thought, oh, it's nothing for me to run 50 miles and get my like jacket and all that stuff over there. And then by mile 15, I was already in a thunderstorm. So it was several hours of like feet underwater in creeks and stuff, and not realizing, kind of like boiling the frog, except for the opposite. It was freezing the frog.
Right.
I didn't realize my body was telling me, you're not warm enough. Your body's shutting down. We're going to start shivering and you're not going to be able to stop. And I didn't read those signs. The
Huh.
second time I went out there, I was on my 40th birthday. I thought, And I got peer pressured into it. A buddy said, "Hey, I wanna go back out there and I want you to go with me." He ended up canceling and not going, so I went out there by myself. Um, anyways, the
So
point
you're
is
like, okay, I failed, I didn't do it, but you're like redemption story. I'm gonna
yeah,
take this.
so, no, because I'm the kind of person that if I'm doing it for me, it's not that important. If someone says, "I want you to be there for me," it's very important. So, I would not have signed up for that race had he not called me and asked me to do it. I told him, I said, "Dude, it's a brutal race, and I don't know if I ever wanna go back to that place again." It was really
Yeah.
dark. It took me, like, a week to get back on my feet after that thing, and he's like, "No, I wanna do it. I want you to be with me." So, I just out of, like I'm the kind of person who if a friend asks me something, I'm like, "I'm there. I got your back. Let's do this together."
Okay.
So, the good news is, even though he never, he canceled shortly thereafter, I had already committed to doing it, and I said, "No," I told myself I would go back out there and do it, so whether or not he's out, I'm not out. And it went terrible. It was probably the deepest I've ever dug in my entire life, and I tried to quit at mile 16 because I'd been, like, crawling and I still had 105 miles to go. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's how bad it was, and, purely just at my ego and feeling, I had someone who had driven, his name wa he's a legend in the ultra running community. His name is Billy Simpson, and he had driven I think like 15 hours. He was retired, but he drove like 15 hours to run the last 40 of the race with me. And I felt so guilty. I was like, man, if I drop and he drove all the way out here for that, I'm going to feel horrible.
Oh.
And I had every intention to drop in that race. Like you could not have talked me out of dropping. It was just the fact that I felt an accountability to other people and I said, "You know, this isn't about you anymore. You told him you would do this, and I'd feel terrible." And of course, like anything else in life, Chad, it took me a while. It wasn't until midnight that I started to actually pull myself together. And the race started at noon. It was midnight that night that I started saying, "I think I'm going to be okay." So
How many miles is that in at that point?
at midnight,
Yeah.
I think I was at mile 40. It was
Okay.
not I was just staying above the cutoffs at that point. Having said that, from mile 40 to 90, I can tell you was some of the best 50 miles I've ever run. Um,
Wow.
Now, granted, at that point, you've been up for, 24 hours or whatever, so you start having a lot of hallucinations and stuff like that, but, I can tell you from 40 to 90, I crushed that race, and unfortunately, the last 25 miles was just an absolute just I got nothing left in me. If I say one word out of my mouth, it's gonna be the words, "I quit," so I just didn't talk. I didn't talk hardly at all the last, like, 7, 8 hours of the race.
And was Billy Simpson accompanying you then?
He did, and it meant everything to me. I was in the he is, one of the toughest guys I've ever met in my entire life. He is a legend in the community, and he wasn't gonna take any crap from me. He wasn't gonna let me blabber on, and, when I saw him, I was exhausted by the time I met him at the race. And we had some stuff go very south. Like, there was supposed to be all this equipment for me at mile 100 that I could change out my shoes and my gear. None of it was there. Um, I didn't think about it. He was really upset for me, but I didn't think about it that much because I just kept thinking, if I say a word out of my mouth, it's going to be the words I quit. So I'm just not going to talk. So,
Wow.
yeah.
That so that does so you mentioned several times, the ego and getting to know your truer self. How do you take that into your growth work or your self-understanding on a day-by-day basis? Are you more conscious and aware now of like when I'm kind of functioning by necessity and ego? And have you do you have an awareness of how to live out of a more authentic place?
The the short answer to that is if you um, I like to say, if you don't go to the well from time to time, you forget where it's at. And
Hmm.
so the point of that is to say, when you ask, like, how do I do that today with the ego, with my efforts and things like that? I know that if I don't have something ahead of me that makes me uncomfortable, and I don't necessarily mean physically, it could be um, an entrepreneurial challenge, it could be a family challenge, it
Yeah.
could be I'm gonna, renovate this room or whatever. If I don't have some type of challenge out there for me, I feel, me personally, I'm going backwards. And I
Hmm.
love this idea of saying, I'm done with this career and I'm done with this thing, and I'm just gonna be like the guy in the cabin who, just kind of reads books and teaches and, just enough to get by and da 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 da. And then the other part of me goes, you'd be bored in 2 weeks, dude. You would be, if you're not challenging yourself to service others, you will be unfulfilled.
I have
Fulfilled.
been, I love that. And so that's interesting. I've been thinking about that in this way of we grow through struggle, we grow and struggle. It brings out the best of us. But I've been kind of asking this question that I think is discouraging in a way too. Well, does that mean that life is constant struggle?
Yeah, absolutely. Only if you're doing it right.
Only if you're doing it right. Oh, wow. Constant struggle. Mm.
Well, the idea is to rebuke and just give up on this idea of eternal peace by doing nothing, because we were not put on this earth to do nothing. And um, the uh, the pursuit of happiness. Um, I always kind of get a chuckle out of that phrase. I'm trying to be happy. I'm pursuing happiness, and I always think, happiness is fleeting. I even told my daughter, she for like when she was into Harry Styles last year, she just talked about him all day long. And she said, if I could get tickets to a Harry Styles concert, I would be happy, truly happy.
Oh,
And I
happy.
just blurted out the words to my daughter one day. I said, whatever gets you happy won't keep you happy. And the idea there was happiness is a very fleeting thing. Our Arthur Brooks said this
Mhm.
phrase. He said that the Rolling Stones got it wrong. It's not I can't get no satisfaction. It's I can't keep no satisfaction, which is
Mm.
whenever whatever makes you satisfied will not keep you satisfied. Um, so it has to be changing in some form or fashion, or we begin to get bored with it. And so, in that sense, it's always about saying, what is it that I'm going to do next? It doesn't mean that I don't have, I try not to allow external material things to be the driving force of that, by the way, which is very easy
Right.
in America, to say,
Right.
once I get this car, I'll be happy.
Oh.
The part that I try to focus on is not what will make me happy, it's what will cause me to be fulfilled. And fulfilled is a different thing, because as far as I can tell, you cannot be fulfilled unless you're causing someone else to be happy. And
Mm.
so think
That's
about
a good
that,
one.
because you don't know people who are, there's plenty of people who can be happy and just be completely self-absorbed. And I'll give you an example. When you're in your 20s or your teenage years and you go out to a movie and out for a burger and fries afterwards, you're like, dude, I'm happy. This is a good day. If you're saying that in your 40s, you need to get a life. If that's
Mhm.
all it means for you to be happy, I can just go out and swipe my credit card now and go, "Oh, I went to a movie theater and I got this. Is that gonna make me happy?" Maybe for a minute, but fulfilled is what you need to be pursuing in your, what I call, the second mountain of your life. Your first mountain, in
Yes.
our case, the first mountain is the American dream, which is the first 3 levels of Maslow's hierarchy. You have air, water, check. You have shelter, check, level 2.
Security.
Security. You, Chad, I know you're married. You have a wonderful family, and you have the 3 levels. Check. That is the first mountain. Job security. American dream. Now, after 40, if you're not looking at how do I pursue the never ending pursuit of self efficacy, if you're not looking at that, you're just, in my opinion, you're just not growing. Now,
Right.
what I'm not going to say is that growing is right for everybody, because there's
Mm,
going to be a lot of your classic blue collar workers. They go to church, they do their thing, and they're like, this is it. I'm content. I'm happy with this. I think of the hobbits in that regard. They just want a garden, have their world, and be what they are. But then, as you know, with the hero's journey, the requirement of the hero's journey for Joseph Campbell is that the hero has to refuse the call initially and say,
right.
I don't want to do this. This is not my choice. I have to, I feel like I have to do it. And then the last level of the hero's journey is that you have to play the mentor to someone else. You have to go back to the village and tell them what you learned from slaying the dragon. In the case of Star Wars, which is probably the best example of the hero's journey, he has to go on to teach the next Jedi how to be a Jedi.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think this is a good segue to asking you for maybe the next generation, thinking like they're these digital natives that have known almost nothing other than being behind their screens. There's Gen Z, there's
Hmm.
a lot of mental health suffering
Yeah,
there, and they're more open to saying what that they're struggling with
very
depression.
much.
Eh, how, and this may be impossible to answer, but I'm just going to try it. How do we encourage or get those people who are behind their screens all the time to get embodied and to challenge themselves and recognize this need and to challenge themselves, maybe let's just say physically.
Okay. If you want to focus on the physical, the problem that I'm going to give you when I give you this answer is you better know why you're doing it. And sadly, most of the people in that generation are wanting to post a selfie of to look like their influencer, right? That looks great in
Right.
the picture.
Yeah.
So my first issue is like, um, what would you be willing to do if you could never post about it? That's something that it just removes the motivation for a lot of that generation to go, well, if I do this, I want everyone to know about it. And the issue I have with that is, well, are you doing it for them or for you? Are you doing it for you? And with,
Mhm.
if you're the kind of person who will only volunteer at things as long as you can post it on Instagram, while I'm not adverse to posting those things on Instagram, what I will say is if that's your primary motivation, it's in the wrong place. And the same goes for when you talk about physical stuff. I think if you're just trying to look good for an Instagram post, you will quit as soon as you either get the pictures right or you burn out, whichever one happens first. But it's not going to fuel you. And
Okay. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Please
so
finish your thought.
the point of that is to say if you're just looking for the next hit of dopamine to like check off your box
Mhm.
and say, I got 100 likes on this picture versus 150, um, that's going to be fleeting, is what I was going to say.
Yeah, yeah. So it's such a good point, and I like that you're beginning there. It reminds so I'm in a book club. We just finished The Courage to Be Disliked,
Hmm.
which is a bestseller, fantastic, fantastic book. Using a lot of, I think you would really like it, using a lot of Adlerian psychology. Adler is maybe more influential than Jung and Freud, by the way, but so many of his concepts are just kind of that we don't attribute them to him, but they do come from him. It's
Yeah,
fascinating stuff.
putting it
And
on my list.
one of the principles is you need to remove yourself from the need for recognition. Now, we all have a community
We do.
need. We all really want to feel like we're contributing something of value, even if it's not money. That helps us feel fulfilled.
That's
Uh,
right.
but we have to do it removed from the need to be recognized. And then that's true freedom, is the argument that
Yeah.
it, yeah, isn't that interesting? And
Yeah, especially as a parent, because I get in this. dilemma all the time, and I've always stood my ground on this with my kids. If they were here, they would quote this to you with their eyes in the back of their head because they've heard it so many times, which is, um, the difference between me being your friend and me being your father is I'm not a lot of my decisions for you are not gonna be popular because your friends will tell you what you wanna hear and what will make you happy. I'm here to help you grow into a self-sustained adult who does not need me to be there.
Oh
And,
yes, yes. And
uh
that is like what it like that's Adler would say like what is the task of we like the separation of tasks. What is our task as a parent? What is their task as a child? And a lot of parents like make their they overdo their task. But yeah, I think that idea of what you're advocating for with your kids is this idea of helping them recognize their task at so that and if the idea of parenting is to equip for independence, then I think that's a good message.
Yeah, now I'll be the first to say I've been a single parent for about 13 years, and we have a very good 50-50 arrangement and whatnot. But
Mhm.
I will be the first to say I'm very flawed in that I didn't have a female for the last 13 years necessarily to balance out my personality as a guy. So, normally when you're married and you have that joint union, you come together as a voice. In my case, I've always tried to mimic what would that voice be like, but I'm
Mm.
so biased, Chad. When I say things, I go, if someone were here to kind of offset me, I'm sure this would have come out a little better. But I remember, one of my kids the other day was kind of like having an emotional moment. And they
Mhm.
said, Mom always helps me when I'm having a crisis. And I said, and that's what I told him. I said, your mom will always save you when you have your crisis. It's your dad's job to teach you how to solve the crisis. I said, those are two completely different perspectives. And it's not, I said, and I'm not good at that necessarily good at consoling. Um, I generally try to teach him, okay, let's give this. I love the idea, Chad, of anytime you have a setback in life, whether it's losing a job, losing an opportunity, a family member you love died,
Yeah.
whatever the case, I love putting a statute of limitations on your loss. So you say, I'm gonna allow myself to be kind of like in a pity party for 24 hours. Most things I'll give my I got my car broken into last week. I said, I'll give you 5 to 6 hours to kind of grieve over this, and then we got to move on. And historically, I did not do that. I would just continue to get angry about it as each day passed and go, man, they took my favorite headphones and man, they took this and I feel violated. And I go,
Yeah.
now I say, hey, Daniel, you put a stop loss in place for 6 to 7 hours, and we agreed that that was the cutoff, and it's time to move on. When I feel that spark of like, oh, I'm starting to go in my
Mhm.
car. And in fact, the very night after I had gotten, robbed, I was getting in bed and I started to do this thing where I was like, "I'm gonna be listening tonight to see if I hear any noises, and I'm gonna leave the blinds open so I can see my car." And immediately I said, Number 1, you put a stop loss in place, and if you think that what that guy took from you is as valuable as peaceful sleep, even just a week of peaceful sleep and not having to worry about someone violating you again, it's not. And if you do think that, your priorities are in the wrong place. So I immediately, and I'm happy to say, I did not hear noise that night. I put earplugs in. I was like, I'm done. I'm going back to my life.
Yeah.
I'm resting. I've let go of this incident. Clearly, he needed the stuff he took more than I did. But the
It
point of
does
that,
feel yeah, it's hard
yeah,
not to take that personally. It's but it
but
sounds like you've developed some tough uh like your whether this came before or after, it sounds like you've developed some resilience
yeah.
uh through
Well,
your
yeah, and you got to be sure that you're not misplacing your efforts because if I
Mm.
start channeling my energy towards the anger, then I'm not
Yes.
channeling it towards the things in life where I need to be present and available. The Buddhists have a saying that if you're angry, it's like carrying a hot coal in your hand and waiting to throw it at the person who wronged you. And I like that because the whole time you're angry, you're just sitting there burning that hole in your hand, going, once I get this person, I'm gonna da
Yeah.
da 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 da. And
That's
it's
great.
so I try to think about, hey, what is the opportunity cost if you want to take this back to economics? What is the opportunity cost of being focused on this thing that's in the past? You can do nothing about it now, and it's taking away from me being present with my child at this moment because I'm gritting my teeth over, blah 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 blah.
What are you doing right now? You're the innovation specialist
Mhm.
at Trident Transport. That sounds fun. What do you innovate?
Absolutely, man. So one of the things I took from my career in corporate, a big corporation, was I had an IT background, and they taught me Lean Six Sigma,
Hmm.
which was process design and quality. I mean, Toyota paved the way for Lean, by the way. Toyota manufacturing, just in time manufacturing, on those type of things. And then I did a lot of facilitation, kind of like I think it's kind of like what you do, Chad, where when you partner with somebody, you go in and say, where do you want to be? What is that success? That's the number one question I always ask. I work directly for the CEO and the founder, and I say, anytime they say, hey, we think this would be a good project, the first thing I'll always say is, let's pretend the project's already done and it was a complete success. How do you measure what that success was? Tell me in tangible terms. Don't just
Hmm.
say, "Oh, we're making more money." Okay, well, in what way? In what revenue? In what? For example, when you're pursuing revenue, it's easy to say we want to pursue growth.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the first thing that's always on my mind when someone says we got to grow this much by this time, the first thing I think is, okay, well, at what cost? Because if you're willing to, burn the tires, burn out the engine, you can just put that car as high as it'll go and whatnot. But I mean, Starbucks is probably the best example I can think of, where they were opening something like a store every 13 minutes or something like that for like a year and a half, and then they had to turn around and close like 2,500 of them or something. And the CEO said, we have prioritized growth over everything else, and now we're picking up the tab on that. So
Huh.
there's trade-offs with stuff like that. As an innovation specialist, what I do is I generally bridge the gap between how does technology enable my leaders at Trident Transport to grow, which means when some vendor comes to you and says, "Hey, I've got a product. It's a big shiny button. You push it, and you're going to make more money." I'll I'll definitely say, "Okay, let's talk about this. Show me how this looks." You want to talk metrics? I can talk metrics all day long because
Yeah.
I've done data analytics, and you're going to have to prove to me. And I'll tell them when we're doing. I say, "What are your KPIs?" Because when 6 months after we agree with you, I'm going to come back to you and hold you to these KPIs, and they know it too. Most of the vendors I've worked with now go, "He's not kidding." When they introduce me to somebody, they go, "He's not kidding. He's gonna hold you over the flames." So that's a part of what I do. But I would say, above all, Chad, the reason, if you look at a Venn diagram of your
Mhm.
specialties, like what is it that you bring to the table, Chad? Um, I am constantly going, what is it that's in those three or two or three circles where I'm in the middle that I go, there's no one else that can quite do this the way I do. Doesn't mean there's not better people out there, but in terms of the immediate workforce that I'm with every day, what is it that I bring uniquely to this role? I would argue that empathy is a big part of it. And when I sit with people, I have it's sort of a joke. It's sort of true. I say a third of my job is technology, a third is business strategy, and a third is office therapist,
Yeah.
because I sit with power players, whether it's in the company, outside the company, within the company, two different parties. And I generally try to say, what is it that you want to accomplish, and why do you want to accomplish it? And you'd be surprised how often, a lot of these projects never get off the ground, because once they do the deep work and they realize this isn't really the problem and this definitely isn't the solution,
Hmm.
it's a year where, any project they say can be done in 6 months, it generally takes about a year to actually get it seen through to fruition. But
Right.
um, Cal Newport, I read his book Slow Productivity while I was on vacation, and he had a good metric. He's like, any project is pretty much 2x what you really think it's going to be.
It's
And
weird how it always turns out like that.
it is. And anytime I say, oh, I can get this done in 90 days, I look and I go, man, it's been 100 days and it's not quite wrapped up. It's been 130 days, it's not quite wrapped up, so.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That I want to. I have that book, The Slow Productivity. I want to read it. I've read some of Cal Newport.
Fantastic. It's fantastic book. I read it on vacation and thought it was a great use of my time.
Yeah, and I can see how you would abide by a lot of his principles of
I'm trying to.
focus,
I'm
not be
trying to.
distracted.
Deep work is that I still struggle with, doing that deep work and putting the phone in a different room and
We all
really
do.
just it's deep work is to me, it's the gift that we squander most frequently in today's world because we allow ourselves to let the rings, I call them the rings and dings, pull us away from that magical moment to where we get a sort of cathartic breakthrough. And the problem with deep work is it's not sexy. It's very slow. It's not immediate because it's not like you can suddenly get into that zone and
Right.
start producing meaning. It actually, I mean, any writer will tell you when you write 4 pages, usually the first two that you start off with, you're going to end up throwing them out so you can get to the paragraph that's in the fourth. So you want to just skip to the fourth and have the quote. But what people do instead is go on Twitter and copy and paste someone else's quote and put it on their feed and say, look at this insight. It's like, yeah, but what are you doing?
Right.
If you're going to do this, if you're going to post um, the courage to be disliked, if you're going to please put something under that that says, this is how I'm applying this today.
Right.
Because
Hmm.
that's,
How do
to
you
me, you're just,
practice?
yeah, you can't copy and paste your way to success. Certainly
Nice.
not as
Yeah.
a person. You need to be able to say, how do I make this mine? How do I tell others this quote means this to me, and here's how I did it, as opposed to just throwing it out there.
Yeah, I think Cal Newport undermines that flow thing. He's like, look, flow's fine, right? But what what's the we idealize flow, right? And it's
Yeah. So
your message is grit. And
yeah,
that's the real like getting occasionally you'll hit
yeah,
flow as a result of grit.
yeah. There's a quote from a writer I heard the other day, and it said, "Inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us show up and do the work every day."
That's right.
So when it comes to the ultra marathoning is the most boring sport in the world, and it is the absolute opposite of the Rocky montage, which is what all of us really want, is a Rocky montage that sort of highlights what we are. But the truth of the matter is you got to put in your hours, man. And
Mhm.
you know, every overnight success that you see is usually like 8 to 10 years in the making or something
That's
like that.
right. I love it. And this has been a great conversation. I knew it would be. And
Yeah.
for the listeners, we've never met before
Yeah.
and just great stuff. Could you want to share with everybody about your invention
Sure.
before we get off here?
Yeah. So back to saying, like, in your Venn diagram, what are you doing for the world, right? What are you doing to not, and I don't mean in terms of like, Elon Musk or something like that, but more so just saying, more, Steve Jobs used to use the phrase, I want to put a dent in the universe. And for me, I think, what I do in my day-to-day job is something that it provides for my family. It gives me a little bit of challenge and whatnot. But as you can tell from the ultra running, I'm always kind of looking outside that to say, well, what else am I doing? And in this case, I've always been very passionate about health, and I thought, oh, it'd be nice to kind of help people in the health community along their journey. I I read this book several years ago, the Sprout book, and it talked
Hmm.
about all the benefits of sprouts. And in case you don't know this, people have been growing sprouts in mason jars for over 50 years. They just go buy a mason jar, go on Amazon, type in sprouting kit. You're going to get a mason jar with a lid that has holes in it.
And that's it.
That's it. And there's no innovation in it. And it would drive me nuts because, and during lockdown, because jars don't allow airflow, right? It's pretty simple. It's a jar. There's no airflow. It's coming in through the front. So when I would ask people why they weren't growing sprouts, they would tell me something I really knew deep down, which is I don't want to deal with mold and mildew issues, which happens all the time. And sprouts are one of the most nutritionally dense things you can possibly put in your body, especially broccoli sprouts, which have sulforaphane in them, which is the magic. They've tried to patent this thing. It's like the most anti-cancer, nutritious thing you can put in your body, but you got to eat the sprouts.
Whoa.
Yeah. And it's crazy how nutritious they are, but the problem that they can't commercialize them is they're not shelf stable. So if you make them in a factory, by the time you get them to Whole Foods, it's usually too late, unless it's something like barley grass or something. But as
Okay.
far as like the true microgreens or sprouts, it's rare that you see that. Maybe at a farmer's market, and they're going to charge you an arm and a leg for a handful of sprouts. So what I did was I said, I bet my cousin during lockdown, I said, I bet I can come up with a better way to do this in, I think I said something like 5 weeks and $5,000. I can come up with a better way to do this. That turned out, you want to talk about 2x? It was more like 10x, all
Uh,
that.
really?
Maybe 20x. Yeah.
It took a while.
It took a while. I went through about 7 prototypes. I have one right here.
Well, and this is a
This is the sprout
sprout
spout.
spout.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Is it ready for market?
yeah, it's got the website's up, and we're going to start shipping them probably by the time this airs. But
Let's go.
yeah,
I,
so it has,
I'm excited. I want one.
yeah, so what you do is you pour your soap seeds in this, and to address the issue with airflow, I created this snap bottom here, and the
Yeah.
design of this was to allow the sprouts to grow with room. We had to go back to the drawing board. I think 3 different times we had to scrap the entire project. And the one thing that we struggle with the most with the design was I said everything should be able to just toss it in the dishwasher and you're done.
Yeah.
And we ended up coming up with this approach, which is a stainless steel disc that slides in here for easy. You can just take this, throw it in the dishwasher, you're done. As far as the top, I mean, I have a prototype downstairs. It's going to look like this in a year. It doesn't change.
Yeah.
I don't even use soap on this. I just give it a quick rinse and it's done. This, because that's where the water accumulates and whatnot, you'll probably want to give this a scrub with a brush or throw it in your dishwasher.
Okay.
The average mason jar, if you look at their instructions for any sprouting device out there, the average one will tell you throw 2 tablespoons of broccoli sprouts in there. This handles a half cup of broccoli seeds. So you're getting over 4 times the amount of sprouts for the same amount of work and a lot less cleaning, which is 4 days. I will fill this jar completely full of broccoli sprouts. You don't need light. You don't need dirt. The only thing you need to do is rinse it twice a day. That's
Where
it.
do we get the sprouts?
They're on my website.
Sprout. So that is, and you told me right before we got on. So
Sprout
that's
spout. Yeah.
sprout spout.com.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And you can see the little, that's our little logo there.
That is stinking fantastic. And
Yeah.
I'm inspired about the nutrient rich thing that I'm totally doing this.
Oh,
So
cool. Well, I'll be happy to help you along your journey. And the whole point of it wasn't for extrinsic type things. It was like I want to do something where people can have nutrition, organic. It's all organic. All our seeds are organic. And you don't have to go to the farmer's market. You don't have to go to the grocery store. And if you have one of those devices, here's my commitment. If you have one of those devices, you can grow enough that 2 people have sprouts every single day, a handful of sprouts, and you'll never run out because it fills the jar every 4 days.
wow. Now that is truly innovating, Daniel. That's great. That is fun. How neat to learn about that on The Humanist, right? So who knows what you might come across
Who knows?
on this channel. So thanks so much for being willing to not even know me, not really even a very new podcast, hopping on and giving of your valuable time to be with us. So
Happy
thank
to
you,
do it,
Daniel.
Chad. Hey, it was a true blessing, buddy. Take care.